therapy can be helpful. Instead of being ashamed about surviving, you can actually say, wow, that's pretty amazing that I survived this, actually.
Yeah. And that just feels like an amazing, a fantastic resource for people that they can lean on.
I think that's the process of really, I think self-compassion is a critical, or at least a part of that really has your best interest in mind, that really looks after you.
You used a phrase a second ago about the DSM, where something, to poorly paraphrase you, is something along the lines of these fictitious diagnostic categories. I don't want to get too in the weeds here because most of the people who listen to this are not psychiatrists, but would you mind expanding on what you mean by that?
Well, I was, by luck and by longevity, part of this process.
Yeah.
So, I'm training at this Harvard hospital many years ago, and people are beginning to find some drugs that seem to change depression and might change schizophrenia. Around the same time, people are beginning to know something about brain chemistry, and we get the technology to look at brain chemistry. And so now we have an agreement about what do we call for certain behaviors. So we cobble together something with some, and we have no scientific data, but we have little committee meetings of people who treat these patients, and we sort of come to a consensus, not on the basis of scientific stuff, but on sort of clinical immersion. But that looks like a category that more or less belongs together.
Yeah.
So DSM comes out, and Bob Spitzer writes in the preamble, this is just an attempt at categorization. It is too inaccurate to ever be used for insurance or forensic purposes. That paragraph disappears in subsequent editions, and now people believe that these lists of symptoms actually are a disease. No, we created this very goodness of our intellect and our minds in order to see what drugs would work for what particular symptoms. Now it turns out that these drugs are not particularly helpful, but it also turns out psychiatry has become a bunch of drug pushers who don't know anything about anything else anymore. And so it's actually sort of committed suicide as a profession.
Would you expand on that? We're related to trauma. Do you think the categories in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, right, for people who don't know what that acronym means, or do you have reservations about those diagnostic criteria in the current DSM?
Can I say it any more offensively than I already have?
Yes, you could actually. You were unusually polite there, considering your willingness to just let it rip. So I kind of wonder.
Yeah. What's interesting is that I was on the committee, and I don't know how I got to not be in the last committee. I think it had something to do with I started to talk about attachments. And every time I talked about attachments in the committees, it was as if I had farted. Like, and what the DSM thoroughly misses is that we are who we are because of who you are, the Ubuntu idea.
Absolutely.
You're all interconnected human beings, and you're not one little creature who has abnormal serotonin abnormalities all by yourself. No, we're interactive creatures. And so what we should be measuring is, what is our interactive world like? Who am I with you? How do I take you in? I mean, are complex things to negotiate, having your needs and my needs met at the same time. And you need to be a fairly high-functioning person to be able to do that, unless you have a hierarchical attitude where what the boss tells you is always right and everybody else is always wrong. And we go back to the old patriarchy. But what we should be studying is, how do we integrate with each other, and how these different disorders that we have, how they affect interpersonal processes and interpsychic processes. So this whole dimension of complexity is actually sort of missing at this point. So we'll shake our heads if the planet survives 50 years from now. We'll go like, oh my God.
I'm wondering how you think that aspect plays into this whole thing.
I think the big issue is our politics is increasingly mirroring the dynamics of an abusive family, where what you see is not true. We follow the meanest, nastiest person. We call other people enemies. If you spell the truth, you get bomb threats, or people come to your house and do terrible things, and the truth can no longer be spoken. And I think that I ascribe the success of my book to the fact that our society is replicating an abusive family right now.
Yeah.
And that people are really trying to see some light because it resonates with so many people because they grew up like this. So we are really reliving the abuse in our political systems. And, is gross inequality in society bad for people? Duh. You need my advice on that. Like, I'm not an economist, but it is bad for people. But we don't do anything about it. We don't do anything that people cannot not afford the medications, that people cannot get insulin, that people can't go to a school, people cannot learn things, all that stuff. The social realities are staring you in the face, and people go, no, I'm not seeing it. There's no trauma correlation.
Yeah.
And I foster these things from time to time. And what becomes obvious is that traumatized people have a hell of a time doing this sort of adjusting and flexibility, and you get what you want this time, but next time I get it. The trauma lives on in them, and the trauma really makes it very hard for them to make compromises and to stay goal-directed. And there's also always a lot of hurt feelings because the trauma keeps us interfering with people effectively subsuming their ego or their needs or their systems under a larger thing, because the trauma really interferes with that. It's a very huge issue, of course, because the number of people who could form an effective coalition is in the millions.
Billions worldwide. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What I see as kind of like themes in this conversation that we've been having so far is that we have this rigidity on the one hand, this kind of frozenness, this stiffness, hierarchical structures, authoritarian structures also sometimes have this rigidity inside of them. And then on the other hand, we've got this flexibility, imaginative processes, ways of seeing the world in a new light. And as you were saying for a second there, Bessel, people who have been through very, very difficult experiences, as we've said over and over again, have a hard time moving into those more flexible, imaginative spaces for a whole bunch of different understandable reasons. They were unsafe, they were punished for them, whatever. What have you found tends to support people in like initially resourcing themselves to be able to engage some of those processes or take on some of those interventions?
Well, I go back to this resiliency issue, is that everybody finds ways of surviving.
Yeah.
And I started that. How have you managed with this? And then you come into another really interesting observation, is that most of the great changes in the world for the better have been made by traumatized people. When you read the biographies of Isaac Newton, for example, oh my God, what horrendous childhood he had. So he escaped into mathematics. Oprah Winfrey, Nelson Mandela, Bishop Tutu, now on and on and on. If you come from trauma, you also come from a position, hopefully, where you say, the world cannot continue to go on the way it is. And if you come from a really enjoyable family, maybe you guys, you hope to change the world, but you don't. If you come from a nice family, there's no urgency to change
the pressure
world because you'll be okay anyway.
Yeah, totally. Pressure isn't the same.
And so trauma is also a tremendous impetus to change the world. For example, after the Second World War in Europe, one damn world war after another, killing billions of people, they said, we need to have income equality. We need to have social security. And Europe totally changed as a result of the Second World War, following Roosevelt's hope for America. Too bad Roosevelt died too young, so he never got to implement it in America, universal healthcare, universal education. But those ideals came as a result of the Second World War, of people saying, man, we are just committing suicide. We cannot go on this way anymore. And of course, America right now, we are in some ways committing suicide. And I wonder when we're going to wake up and say, guys, we are killing ourselves.